Hello, I am Star Jones, the chairperson of the United States Commission for the Preservation of America's Heritage Abroad. The commission, which I represent, the purpose is to preserve cultural heritage between the United States and countries which sent immigrants to America so that memory is not lost, so that culture can live on. We believe only by preserving the legacy of victims of the Holocaust and the World War II atrocities can we prevent it from being repeated. In remembering, we raise our voice for those who have no voice and seek to preserve and protect the history and legacy of their lives. Today, I am so pleased to be speaking to someone who really believes in the notion of awareness leads to action. George Elbaum. George was born Jewish in Warsaw a year before Hitler invaded Poland and began World War II. Within weeks, his father was called into the army, never to return. Aware of their danger, his mother dyed her hair blonde and bought identification documents of a dead Catholic woman. In 1942, she smuggled George out of the Warsaw ghetto and paid Polish Catholic families to hide him. Reunited at the war's end, they immigrated to America in 1949. He earned an undergraduate degree, 2 masters, and a PhD from MIT, and made a successful career as an engineer, notably in aerospace. Such a brilliant man. Long reluctant, however, to speak about his past, he has in recent years become a major speaker and author and philanthropist on Holocaust matters. Neither yesterday's nor tomorrow's relates his childhood in Poland and the US. He has described his experiences from hundreds of presentations to young people in both Poland and the United States in yesterday's Revisited, Today's Youth View on the Holocaust. Much of George's Polish work is with the Forum for Dialogue, and I am so proud and honored to say he's the forum's largest donor. So he puts his money where his mouth is. I understand you actually spent most of the war in hiding. And when we say hiding, help me to understand, because you move from family to family. Your mother was very clear on keeping you protected.
Right.
And so walk me through that.
My mom moved me from one Polish Catholic family to another. At that time, my hair was light brown. Turns out my hair turned black like hers only after the war. At that time, my hair was light brown. I didn't look Jewish, and I didn't know I was Jewish. And perhaps that's something that has kept me safer, because when a Nazi soldier came to one of the Polish families that was keeping me, and I just looked at him and I smiled at him, and I didn't know I was in any danger.
Yeah, you did. You had no reason to be afraid because you didn't know that you were somebody that was a purported enemy.
Exactly. So ignorance sometimes is bliss, and that saved me a number of times.
What do you think you were hoping for when you came to America?
You know, when I saw the friendliness of the people, even in North Carolina, even though before I spoke English, the kids were very friendly. They tried to teach.
I'm from North Carolina, George, just so you know.
Oh, I know that. I know that.
I'm from North Carolina, just outside of Charlotte.
I know that. Whereas, as a matter of fact, my first date was from Charlotte, except I didn't know what a date was. My first summer in America, my mom put me in a summer camp in Hendersonville.
Oh, yeah.
And kids were going out on dates. You know, I didn't really understand it because my English was very poor. And I remember there's a girl from Charlotte that I liked her. So we were going one day a week. We would go into the town for a movie. And somebody said, well, you know, why don't you ask
somebody that you like. And so I asked her to come with me. And there's one of the big boys, 12 years old, maybe 13 years old. And he was very, very um, debonair, curly blonde hair. And he turned to me and he said, we were on on the back of this truck, actually going to town. And he said, well, is she your date? Well, I didn't understand that she was my date. I knew we were going on a date, so I kind of said, well, I think so. So he said, well, why aren't you holding her hand? And I thought, why should I be holding her hand? I was 11 years old, it meant nothing to me. And I was so embarrassed. These are the kind of, memories that stay with one when one's,
Yes.
throughout, like being embarrassed. And I don't think I embarrassed that easily, but apparently when I was a kid, I did.
I found that some parts of the Jewish American community appear to be resentful or bitter or not at all interested in Poland because of the atrocities of the war and present day issues. So, having left Poland and come to the land of milk and honey, which we both agree, what's your attitude towards Poland now?
Until about 12, 13 years ago, I never wanted to go back to Poland because of a lot of the bad things that have happened. I didn't focus on the details, but I loved America and I wanted to stay here and I didn't want to go to Poland. But somehow by accident, uh, uh, I was speaking at a school in Seattle um, that had a group of Polish and other international students there. And I was speaking there, and the Polish teacher said, I understand why you don't want to go back to Poland, but we're going to have an event like this, an international event. Would you come and speak in Poland? And again, I said, no, I don't want to go back to Poland. And she was very smart. She said, in your book, there's a photo of your father. And I understand you don't remember him because he left for the war when you were 1 year old. But I found in the archives, the 1939 Warsaw phone book. And here's a page with your father's name, address, phone number, his profession. He was a lawyer. And I looked at that and it hit me like almost like a physical blow to my chest that, yes, I really had a father. His name was Julian Elbaum. It's like, wow. And that made me go back to Poland. And that made me interested in what's happening in Poland. And I realized that Polish history and Jewish history are almost, they go in parallel. You can't really separate them. And and I realized that when I speak in Poland now, I never feel quite as Jewish as when I speak in Poland because I know there's anti-Semitism there, and I've been faced with it in Poland, and I'm glad that I'm there because I managed to do something about it just because of my talk. I mean, my first time in Poland when I was speaking in English, and all the students there spoke English. But I learned afterwards from the teacher that arranged this talk that a student came up to her the previous day and said, I don't want to go to Elbaum's lecture. And she asked, well, why not? I said, and he said, because he's a Jew. Well, she said, so what? Well, I hate Jews, he said to her. Well, why do you hate Jews? Because my grandfather hates Jews. And if he hates them, I hate them too. She was very wise. She says, then don't come. But I shipped 200 books to them. They're all in English. At that time, this was before my book was translated into Polish. And she saw this student standing with all the others holding my book for autographs. It was long, long line. But I always made sure that I would say something to each of the students or teachers that were signing book. I wanted to make sure they really understood English. And I always got a very good answer. And I didn't know who that was, but there was one of the students that came up to me was apparently a student that initially refused to attend, but only the teacher knew that. And apparently I said something to him or he said something to me and he and I started a short conversation. We were laughing together. And she wrote to me, he will not grow up to be anti-Semitic and neither will his children. And I realized, hey, that's one. There surely were other students that were also anti-Semitic. They just didn't come forward. So if there's at least one positive effect I had, um, uh, that was an accomplishment.
Yes, indeed. And we don't know which other young children he spoke to before, during, or after your lecture. And more importantly, who was watching his interaction with you, your natural, loving, fatherly teacher interaction with this young man. They could be watching from afar, and all of a sudden, just a conversation, a talk, becomes a way to bring awareness and then move to action, which is, of course, the whole purpose of the Forum for Dialogue. George, tell me, what has motivated you to give so much, and how did your commitment begin, and why this organization?
I heard about the Forum for Dialogue, and there was some mixed connection, but I finally connected with them, and by accident, because of the surgery I had, I arrived in Warsaw a few days earlier to kind of recuperate from the jet lag. And when they found out that I was there, they had previously arranged some talks for me in schools, but they also said, hey, tomorrow we're going to have this conference, the annual conference of the activists, who at that time were called the leaders of dialogue. Now they're, I guess, the network of dialogue. And they asked me if I would come to it. And I said, well, it's if it's walking distance from the hotel. I just had a surgery, so if it's walking distance, well, no, it's out of town, but we'll pick you up. And they, by that time, had already, this is the Forum, had already printed, translated and printed my book, and they distributed it to the like 70 or 80 of these activists that they gathered together. And at that time, I didn't really have much contact with the Forum. But when I visited them and when I spoke at this conference of the Polish citizens, I got a wonderful reaction, and I spoke to them through a translator. I said, "Why do you do this?" Because they were all, they weren't Jewish. They were all from smaller towns throughout Poland, and one after another told me the same thing. Because we are proud citizens of our town, and Jews were an important part of our town before the war, and we want to preserve that heritage. And I was so impressed by it. And many of my Jewish friends couldn't believe it, that these 70, 80, and now I guess more like 100 and something Polish Catholic citizens would be investing their time, investing their money, investing their efforts just to recover Jewish heritage in their towns because they're proud of their towns.
Absolutely. It's Polish heritage also. And the information, the interaction was a part of society and culture. And if we fail to acknowledge the role that Jews played in all aspects of society, that's how we lose the culture.
Well, that is exactly why I was so turned on by the activists, that they weren't doing it for any personal gain. They were doing it just because of their pride in their own city.
I know that you had to encourage the Forum to organize a program for groups of Polish and Ukrainian students as a response to what was going on with the war in Ukraine.
When Russia invaded Ukraine on March 24th, what struck me was how history repeats itself, because I imagine people in Kiev knowing that this massive Russian army would be on their doorstep within days or weeks, and life would never be the same. And I instantly imagined my parents on the 1st of September 1939, hearing that the Nazis had just invaded Poland, and that indeed the Nazi army would be on their doorstep in Warsaw, and life would never be the same, as it wasn't.
You know, you said that you didn't know that you were Jewish and that you found out about it later in life. I was going to ask you, how did your experiences during and after the Holocaust impact your faith or belief system? But I think you just said to me, um, you are not particularly religious, but it sounds like you have a relationship with what spirituality should be, which is to be good to other people and to be purposeful in your living, and find ways to serve and be a valuable member of society. Is that sort of online with what you're talking about?
I would say it's exactly online. And I'll tell you, right after the wars, this was already in early 1945. I was just turned 7. And I remember I was talking to, I was playing with some kids in our neighborhood, in our courtyard. And one of the kids, and at that time, because I was raised as a Catholic, and I never practiced it because the other kids, with the families where I lived, they didn't practice. They would pray, and so I would ask them, "Well, why do you pray?" "Well, because we don't get fed." So okay, I'll pray also. But it was I did what I was either told to do or what I thought would be good for me because the other kids were doing that.
Mhm.
So,
Sort of like your dating life, as I think about it now. When you were a young kid, you went on your first date because the other kids were going on their dates.
yeah, yeah, but I didn't understand what it was all about. Why should I hold her hand? So
I love
had
it.
nothing to do with sex.
I love it.
Anyway, yeah, I remember a couple of us were playing in the courtyard when I was 7, and one of the kids called somebody else a dirty Jew. And I'm very liberal now, and I was very liberal apparently then. And I said to this friend, I said, "Hey, how do you know the dirty Jew?" I said, "There are some good Poles and there's some bad Poles. There's some good Jews and bad Jews." And I said, kind of focus on each person and whether you like him or not. And he said, "Well, I don't agree with you." So we started arguing. We started fighting. He got bloody and I got bloody. And my mom then heard about it because it happened in our courtyard. And one of the neighbors apparently told her about the fight. And I guess maybe she asked me what happened. I didn't give her the details, but I had some little scars here. I think that eyebrow stopped moving then. And my mom told me that I was Jewish. Well, I was willing to fight for them, but I wasn't willing to be one because by that time I already knew about the Holocaust and I knew what happened to Jews. And I didn't want that burden. I didn't want that danger on myself, and I didn't want that burden to carry with me. And I started crying. It was a major, major cry. You know, I never feel quite as Jewish as when I'm speaking to an audience that I know has anti-Semites in them. And I make a point of seeking those kind of situations because I know that some people's minds, students' minds will be changed. I'll tell you one other situation, again, happened in Poland, but it was in a small town where, again, the forum arranged that talk. Before it was all a teacher that we knew in Warsaw was arranging all my talks in Warsaw. And I was speaking in this small town, it was maybe 100 students in the auditorium, but I was told that there would be some German students there. Is it okay if they come to my talk? I said, sure. Because I knew the German students would speak English because that's how they would communicate with the Poles through English. So I gave my usual talk, but I noticed in one of the front rows, there was a blonde girl that was really staring at me intently, more than usual. But I didn't pay much attention, except that when I finished, she almost jumped up from her seat and kind of pushed her way to me. And she said, "I'm one of the German students here. And the story you told me is so different about the conditions in Poland than what I would hear at the dining room table when my parents and grandparents were talking about the war." And she said, "And I'm ashamed of my parents." She started crying, openly crying. And I said, all I could do at that point was put my arms around her and tell her, I said, "Look, what your parents or grandparents did or thought, it's not important as what you would think and what you will pass on to your friends and in the future. So don't worry about it, but just pass on my story." And I just hugged her. And it was a very memorable meeting for me. We get letters. I've probably got more than 20,000, 30,000 letters or email notes from students afterwards. My wife and I read every one of them. We do it together on purpose. And we highlight those phrases that really resonate with us. And we do this all together. And I put those excerpts onto the website, onto the web post for that school without names, just these are the statements that students have made after my talk. Perhaps the most personal thing was that in my talk, I always say that right after the war ended, some Russian soldiers, when we were hiding in a small village in Poland, and I was the only little kid in the room. And when one of the Russian soldiers saw me, he took out a sugar cube and gave it to me. And I didn't know what it was. So my mom said, "That's sugar, take it, taste it, put it in your mouth." And since then, I've had this tremendous sweet tooth. And I say that. And one of the parents at the school, 2-3 weeks ago, remembered that. And she contacted me through the school and said, "We love, my daughter and I love baking. What would you like us to bake you?" And I thought that was a wonderful, wonderful gift. It was doubly, doubly sweet and doubly tasteful because it was given with love.
Absolutely beautiful. Absolutely beautiful. That was just an amazing opportunity to speak to someone who really and truly puts awareness into action. Jewish heritage in Poland is part of the American Heritage Abroad, and as chair of the United States Commission for the Preservation of America's Heritage Abroad, I encourage you to help maintain it by supporting the commission and the work we do. To that end, the commission has joined in a project to support Forum for Dialogue's activists across Poland because we share a commitment to remember and memorialize the past to keep its lessons alive in the present. This work in service of the past, connecting to roots, is also about building relationships for the future in which the past is acknowledged and commemorated, regardless of how difficult or complex it is. I encourage you to go to our website, heritageabroad.gov, and consider contributing to fund our very small 2023 project with Forum for Dialogue. This will establish the foundation on which we can build an even larger effort in 2024 to remember the Holocaust, rebuild connections of Jewish and non-Jewish Americans alike with Poland, and educate about both history and its relevance to the challenges of today and tomorrow. Again, in remembering, we raise our voice for those who have no voice and seek to preserve and protect the history and legacy of their lives. Thank you very much.